Welcome to Captains of Industry. I'm Chris Bishop. Now there's a new Captain of Industry in place in London who hopes to persuade the world business to invest here in Africa. Cheryl Buss, a career banker and now heads up Absa International based in the UK. Who is she? What makes her tick? On this edition of Captains of Industry, we hope to find out. Thank you very much for joining us, Cheryl. So just you've got a big job on there. I mean, admittedly, it's a very topical time. It's the time of Brexit. It's a time of when Africa's looking hard for new foreign investors. But just give us a quick sketch of what you're going to be doing in the next 6 months, first 6 months on the job.
So I've been tasked to lead the Absa International strategy, as you said, and that really involves the build out of our international strategy, UK, Europe, the US. We'll be looking at what we want to do across China, Middle East, Asia, and essentially that's about saying Absa is globally connected to help bring you into Africa. And so really it's relating to our clients at head office locations around the world to, I like to say, take the face of Africa to them.
So again, you know, as I said in the intro, we like you to find out always on these shows exactly what makes you tick, who you are, where you're from. So you're born and bred here.
Born and bred in
Johannesburg.
Yes.
And your folks, they weren't in banking at all. What did they do?
No, they weren't in banking. My dad had various careers that, or various roles that he fulfilled in corporates. One of which actually took us to Zimbabwe. So although I was born and bred in Joburg, we did spend 2.5 years in Zimbabwe whilst he was an expat there. And my mum looked after us whilst also doing some of the roles that she fulfilled. And
that must have been because that was in the mid-80s, I understand.
Yes.
It must
give away my age.
Give away. Don't worry about that. But anyway, in terms of, that must have been quite formative. You were still relatively young then. Zimbabwe was only independent, 5 years then? Must have been quite interesting. What did you get from that?
I think everything about when you grow up is broadening your mind and the different experiences that you have. So I swam competitively. So I think for me, I got to swim competitively in Zimbabwe, which in South Africa we weren't afforded at the time. I think also a breadth of meeting different people, new people, and just seeing a new world. I think it's important, especially today in an increasingly small world that we live in, that you get exposure to as many different cultures and different experiences that you can. And I think I was afforded that very small opportunity, but it was wonderful. And
the big swimming sort of reputation in Zimbabwe as well. I mean, the current sports minister, Kirsty Coventry, Olympic gold medalist for swimming. Exactly. So, and then you came back here, you went through school, and then you decided to go to Wits for your BA.
Yes.
But at this stage, you hadn't decided banking was your way yet. What did you want to study?
No, well, I watched LA Law growing up, so...
LA Law?
Yes,
you wanted to be a lawyer?
I wanted to be a lawyer, of course, as everyone does. So I majored in law at university. And actually, when we came back from Zimbabwe, I went to St. Mary's Girls' School in Waverley. And there was a lot of kind of legal work that we used to do then. I think that's what attracted me. So I was going off to be a lawyer, and then I got to the end of my degree and actually wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And my dad said, "Well, you know what, you can't ever go wrong in banking," which you couldn't in those days.
Yeah, we're talking about
the well-respected bank manager.
Early 90s.
So, exactly. So I went off to banking, just thinking, well, I'll give it a bash and we see where it goes. And I ended up loving it and really developing a true passion.
Before we go to studying banking, what was it about law that put you off a bit?
I think I wanted to get out and start working, really. I wanted to experience what was out there. And I think it was quite set in its ways as opposed to a banking, which back then it was almost like a rising career in terms of interest and the new opportunities that it presented.
So you did a banking course at Wits,
yep.
And then you started your first job, and like a lot of people in banking, in high positions like you are now. You started right at the bottom.
I did.
Just tell us about your first week in the job.
My first day in the job was at Rivonia branch, Standard Bank, in one of the old buildings there. They then moved into a new building, and it was really doing a little bit of everything, which I think has actually stood me in good stead today. So through my career, I've worked in different parts of a bank, and I think today I always say to the bankers who may be in my team that you can't really pull the wool over my eyes because I've learned on the ground.
Well, just tell us a bit about those early days, because as like a apprentice, if you like, you had to do all kinds of menial jobs. So what sort of things did you have to do those days?
Well, back then a bank manager was someone who was obviously really revered in terms of what they did. So you were really making sure that you were keeping your bank manager happy. Obviously dealing with clients on a day-to-day basis, that started quite early. And so my informative working years actually led me to say so I did tasks in the back office or dealing in the accounts department, which was more dealing with clients on a face-to-face basis. So very early on, I realized that I wanted to deal with people, and I wanted to deal with clients, and I wanted to help clients. You've got people who come in with problems, and you want to try and help them and solve their problems. So I think that, in the small way that it started, was what started to shape my thinking into starting to develop where I am today.
So how did you sort of start climbing the ladder then from that entry into banking?
So I tell you what triggered it off. I was then moved to another branch, and there was a cheery old chap who used to walk past my desk every day, and I used to go, "Good morning," and he'd say, "One more day to retirement." And I thought, oh my word, I'm not sure this is for me. And so I thought, well, I need to start to breed my own ground for development, and so started trying to shape and I think really try different roles and different areas in the bank. So started off in retail, moved more into private banking, and then started to dip my toes into corporate banking. So that's kind of how I started moving through. Loved private banking. I spent a good few years there. And then moved into corporate banking. Well,
okay, so you think that was an existential moment for you when you met someone who just said...
Well,
I did work with a guy...
That tipped me over the edge, because I thought, no, I can't be hearing this at all of about 22.
Well, I used to work with another guy who had a good sense of humour as well, but he used to do it the other way. He used to go, "Hey, Chris, 5 years, 3 months, 2 weeks, 2 days and 4 hours." Anyway, but he's long since retired. But okay, and then as you started moving up that, but it must have been when your career started taking off. It was a whole different world in banking. I mean, it was like, well, boom times, if you like.
Complete.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of people, there were branches all over the place.
Yeah.
Try and compare it there to where we are now.
Well, I think, there, as you rightly say, it was boom time. The one thing that always used to strike me was the number of gifts that the managers used to get over Christmas time. Of course, that doesn't happen anymore. And even if they did, we're not able to accept, and I think rightfully so. So when you look at the banking then and the banking today, I think it's definitely become a whole lot more regulated. There's a lot more governance behind it. And there's a lot more banks out there, so you really need to differentiate yourself as a bank and as an individual within the bank to show up slightly differently and to maybe take a different angle, because at the end of the day, one could argue that it's almost a commodity that you're selling, so to speak. So what makes you different?
Well, that's the other thing as well. I mean, bank managers those days, they were like revered members of society, never mind just the bank. But a lot of things have changed, and a lot of other places to get credit these days. I mean, you can get credit on your phone anywhere. Yep. How has that changed in the bank industry overall, you think?
Well, I think the banks face a couple of challenges, and that is we are burdened, but rightly so, with regulation. I think that regulation is there for a reason, and a good reason, and obviously that was enhanced post 2008, the various crises there. However, what it also means is that perhaps they're not always as agile as they could be for the fast-paced changing world as we move into a 4IR environment. And so there are disruptors out there that banks really need to sit back and consider. And when you look and you go, well, as a bank, we may have a big real estate. Is that what we want, or do we want a digital real estate, so to speak? So I think that banks actually, that we need to shift how we think such that we're not disrupted, which is happening every day.
Can you just paint a little sketch where do you think this disruption is going to come from?
Well, I think there are a number of places. It's the fintechs. It's simply put, I think it's anyone that can help move money simply. And it almost goes back to the days which look at the heritage of banking. So a lot of it is that payment mechanism. How easy is it? How quick is it? How cheap is it? Right?
Yeah.
Because that's also where banks are burdened to a large extent, is a huge cost base due to what the heritage is. But we need to be agile and move into a digital world, such that we can compete with these agitators, disruptors. They're good for change, but traditional banks need to move with the times in that
How
respect.
far do you think traditional banks, not just here, around the world, away from, okay, there's like one branch, like a national monument, if you really want something, you can go there, but the rest of it will be virtual banking, online. How far away are we from that, do you think?
Well, I think we're seeing that. I mean, if you take a step back and actually just look at Africa as an example. So Africa, one of the biggest problems is that probably 25% of the population only is financially included. So only about 25% of the population have formal bank accounts. And that poses a whole load of challenges for the development of societies and wider ecosystems. But then with the onset of mobile banking, now you don't actually need a bank account because you can transact on your mobile. And you can build a credit history on your mobile. Transactions can happen from that respect. So just that whole shift has allowed a changing dynamic such that society can be more inclusive and not follow a more historic route of banking.
And as this artificial intelligence also takes more hold, we're going to see a lot more slimline banking groups as well, including your own, I should think. Looking ahead, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, we're talking about 50% of the people we have now, or even less, do you think?
I guess it's hard to put a number on it, and I guess it comes back to the relationship that you build, right? So you say, yes, virtual banking, but people want to still see a face. They want to still have a conversation, and can a robot give you that? Is there AI and robotics being used in data processing centers? Absolutely, and should it be? Yes, that is the future. But I still think that there's a very particular human element which is the differentiator, and so it's hard to put a percentage to it in terms of this is today and this is what the future looks like. But I think it's definitely, those jobs that AI can fulfill definitely pose a risk. But by the same time, I think that the world will shift where human element becomes more, because I think people will still crave that human engagement.
I think so. I mean, some banks I go to now, someone meets you at the door. I mean, the old days you had to go and queue up for a while.
And I certainly don't want to see an avatar at the door. I want to see a person if I'm going into the branch.
Absolutely. So. Good. We're on the same page. So now to your new job. You've got quite a job on your hands because in many ways you could almost argue that a large sector of this very economy we're in here is reliant on how well you do or otherwise in the years to come. How daunting is it for you, this job?
I think it's an exciting challenge. So the offices that we have set up are due to Absa moving as a financially independent bank itself. You will have seen that, as of last week, we went live in all of our countries who have now shifted from the Barclays brand to the Absa brand. So really exciting across all of our countries in Africa, seeing that red Absa really pop up and come to the fore now. And so I think from that perspective, being in London, and starting out the international brand as the Absa, as we emerge as a Pan-African bank, I think it's an amazing opportunity and it's really exciting. We look forward to do the same in the US. We've had our licenses approved. And so it's great to plant a red flag there.
In terms of capital inflows, I mean, what's your target for this year, bringing to investment in Africa?
So I think, we don't have a target necessarily around what the investment flow is. And really what we try to do is assist our clients with what they want to do in Africa. So it's not necessarily attracting FDI itself, but it's rather saying, if you are looking at investing in Africa, be you an asset manager or be you a multinational corporate or be you a bank, we have been on the continent for over 100 years and we are here to assist you with whatever your requirements may be across the continent.
So not only will you be facilitating, but will you also be trying to match up investors and projects? Yeah.
So interesting that you asked that, because speaking to a number of banks in a few client meetings that I've had whilst I've been there, is that investment opportunity is absolutely there. And perhaps it's shifting somewhat in saying, we know in Africa that there's a huge infrastructural development gap. How do we close that gap? But how do you get the investment for it? And so there's a lot of investment that is starting to say, how do you isolate, instead of the traditional funding route, which might go directly into a public sector space, how do you start to get investment appetite into separate projects, and how does that appetite come into projects which will then allow for the infrastructural development across Africa?
Now the game has changed almost from the day you took up the job. I mean, Brexit is, it's actually a done deal. There's a transitional period this year, but on the face of it, from what I'm hearing, is that a lot more companies are a lot keener to look at investing here and establishing themselves in Africa. How are you seeing it on the ground there in London?
When you look at Africa, I think it does go through its cycles. There is absolute, there's always an attractiveness to Africa, but that comes with an element of caution. And so I think that where investors say we have an appetite for something that's slightly different, that offers a good return, albeit not without its own risks, then there is an attractiveness to that. I think we are looking, however, at Africa going, it was a shining star, and Africa was going to offer a lot. It still does. But if you look at what the conversation was around Africa back in 2010, 2011, 2012, that which was promised then hasn't quite developed. And I think maybe that's because of the shortfalls that we're seeing in the infrastructure space, as an example. But moving on today, I think Africa is maybe, although the investment opportunity is there, it is a slightly more austere period that we're going into. And I think that there's a number of key elements that governments and societies and economies in Africa are going to have to deal with in order to really solidify and attract that investment.
What exactly are those areas you're referring to?
So if a lot of question around the governance that goes with Africa. So when you're investing in project, how's the overall governance and framework? If you look at sovereign debt levels are extremely high. That also poses a problem in Africa. Growth hasn't been perhaps as high. Yes, one would argue in Ethiopia it's been 6-7%, but again off a low base. So there are key areas that need to be watched. I think, as I've just highlighted, but the investment opportunity is still there, but I think a lot has to be done around the framework to give comfort to investors.
What about this in the investment world there in London, this sort of Afro-skepticism, for want of a better word? A lot of people there flick through the headlines on their phones and say, oh dear, sorry, we're not investing there, look what's happening in the neighbouring country.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd rebut that with a question to say that there's cynicism in all the markets around the world right now.
Every country.
In every country there are challenges that are being faced right now. Let's look at China, Middle East, Asia, the US. Interestingly enough, I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, and I went to a couple of plenary talks around emerging markets, some Africa-specific one, and then some broader emerging markets. And when you look at the systemic challenges that various emerging market countries are facing, it's the same challenges. It's poor infrastructure, poor governance, poor or weak governments in many instances, struggling to get to grip with a rising nationalism, a growing middle class, number of youth that need to be educated, found jobs. So whether you were listening to someone speak of Africa or speak about South America, the verbiage is the same.
And also sometimes investors tend to think of it as one country, and as we know, it's scores of countries. And I've been lucky enough to report up and down this continent from a number of countries, and a lot of people, when you tell them sometimes about the industries you've come across, you've reported on, the businesses you've seen, people will say, I've never read that anywhere. It's very much still, I think in some ways, still a hidden continent to foreign investors. How do you counter that? As I said to you at the beginning of the show, for me it's about being the face of Africa in global environments, and it's about telling the story about Africa.
but it's not just a shiny apple story, right? There are challenges and that people need to be aware of with a long term. With a long-term view, I think you counter it with what the fact is, and what the reality is, yet what the opportunity is. And so I think it's about having very targeted conversations as well, because it's not for everyone.
On the brighter side of the story, where is the interest? You know, where could money be coming from, and which kind of industries and expertise in Europe to here?
Yeah, I mean, as I said to you, when you look at, when you said the cynicism around Africa investment, honestly, the Africa investment story is there. There is a huge amount of opportunity and a huge amount of investment, which is exciting. It's great to be working with the African continent. And so if we look at where where it's coming from, so let's just take UK and Europe as an example, but UK separately. There was the UK Africa Investment Forum that was held probably 4 weeks ago now. Boris Johnson was there, and he was speaking of the desire of UK to really ignite and reignite those trade corridors that it's had with Africa. If you go into various different countries across Europe, be it Germany, Spain, Italy, just to name a few, France, of course, there's a huge investment opportunity, or rather an investment appetite into Africa. I haven't even touched on the US, and if you look at the US has launched a Prosper campaign, which is to assist American industry into Africa, such that they can also build and develop and help in Africa, and obviously build their own industries as a result. I haven't touched on China, and we all know that the Chinese have huge and significant investment appetite around the African and development story. Yes, that fulfills their own desire around their One Belt, One Road policy, but a huge amount of interest. And then lastly, when you look at the Middle East, Asia, obviously there's Southeast Asia and Middle East, you're looking at increased appetite as well. There's a number of traders that see Africa as a good trading hub, and we're starting to see a move away from traditional corridors, geographic corridors, into so the industries and the sector focus has almost remained the same, but we're seeing new players start to enter in from the Middle East. India has got huge investment in Africa and a lot of appetite as well. So it really makes it for a buzzing continent when you look at the different geographic scope of interest into Africa.
And speaking about China, as you were, I mean, the new areas for investment. I mean, I was at the mining and W of the week, battery metals. I mean, it's huge. And this country is on the verge of getting 10% of world supply in vanadium, for instance, one of the stories I did there. And, you know, that's an incredible investment thing, because everyone's going to be after them for cars and factories and God knows what else. I mean, what gives you, bearing in mind that there are struggles with governance and regulation across the continent, but what gives you hope when you're going out there selling this continent to investors?
A number of things. Just the sheer diversification of the sectors, right? So obviously natural resources is key critical. Agriculture. Africa has one of the largest arable continents in the world. So when you look at possible food shortages, one can't ignore Africa and the development around agriculture in that space. Again, I mentioned youth, so the development opportunities around education, and that leads into, therefore, development and growth around the fast-moving consumer goods as we see economies spin into effect. I mentioned the infrastructure space earlier. 50% of the continent has got formal power. So those opportunities in itself are just, so it's actually pick your sector that you play in, and the opportunities really do abound. As I say, not without their risks and not without their challenges. And the one thing I always say to my clients is, if you have a long-term view, that is what you absolutely need. You can't play in the short term.
Well, best of luck in your new job. Lots of replies on it for this content, that's for sure. That was Cheryl Buss, the CEO of Absa International, someone who's telling the African story to investors in London. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of Captains of Industry. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.